Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Over the weekend I posted a part 2 to the assignment 1, so if you haven't taken a look at that or haven't finished the assignment yet, you might want to take a look at that. Might help you out. Today, or tonight rather, we're going to look at how to apply materials to objects. We're going to look at light sources and maybe creating a little additional scene in context to our assignment that's due tonight, which is not part of the assignment. I just want to go over it so that when we get down to our final assignment that you'll have some context to kind of work with, where you're going to be creating a lamp object based upon a photograph and creating a scene and then rendering that scene with appropriate materials and stuff. So I want to talk about that, and then also some exporting techniques. Maybe you want to export whatever you create to another program like Revit or AutoCAD, and then also flattening or making something 2D so that you could maybe export the parts and create a DWG file that you can cut out in the laser cutter and then put those parts together, or export as like an STL file so that you can maybe print the part in 3D. So you probably need to open up the project. So hopefully everybody has the chair pretty much completed. In part 2 I went over basically how to create the base here, this area. I'm not going to go over that tonight. It's a 20-minute video, so it shouldn't, if you haven't looked at it yet or haven't completed the project, you still have some time to do that. Hopefully what we go over today won't take the full hour, and we'll utilize the last 20 minutes or so of class to work on the project that's due tonight. So with that, let's start by I'm going to move some of this stuff out of the way in the perspective view. So we're just kind of left with the chair itself. So if we wanted to export this chair out into another model, we can go up to File, Export Selected. Let's those had something selected. I didn't want to. File, Export Selected. See if I don't have anything selected, if that allows me to create. Yeah, so if you don't have anything selected, it then asks you to select the object. So you could potentially take an individual piece or the entire element, press enter, and then down at the bottom here is where you basically define what file type it is. So if you wanted to bring this model into Revit, you would utilize this .sat file source. AutoCAD, DWG, DXF, those are two you can utilize for AutoCAD. Revit will also read those as well. Illustrator, so if you're just trying to export line work, to manipulate in Illustrator, you can do that. You could back save it to Rhino 4 or 3 if you had somebody else working on the project that had a previous version of Rhino. 3D Studio .3ds is for 3ds Max if anybody was interested in, you know, rendering, using that as a rendering agent instead of Rhino. You could export it to 3ds Max. I'm pretty sure those are really the only ones that you'll want to utilize. Oh, STL. So STL is the file type. And you might want to talk to Jay as well. STL might not be the only file type that can be printed 3D, but that's the one that I'm most familiar with, because that's the one that Revit uses. But yeah, you might want to talk to Jay before doing that. Maybe there's a different one. Here's SketchUp, so if you want to transfer it into SketchUp, if for some reason your building's in SketchUp or whatever, I don't know. Why would you ever do that? No, SketchUp's a very good, quick modeling tool. So at any rate, that's how you would export your model into another software. And so we're not going to talk about importing it into other softwares, but just exporting. And you'd click save and save it to wherever you would want to save it to. So the other thing that you can do we haven't really talked about was setting C-planes. I know I mentioned it, but what's kind of cool is that you can set your construction plane to a particular object or side. So for instance, if you wanted to draw something off of this side, you could select it, and then that becomes your construction work plane. So it's similar as setting your construction work plane in, I think most of you were in the 244 course, which is Revit, but you can set it specifically to, you know, an object, and so I'm going to set it specifically to the base of this curve, so that we're at the bottom of our object here. And I'm going to create kind of just a quick little scene. So what I'm going to do is draw a rectangle corner to corner, and just kind of specify maybe 120 by 120, which is a 10 foot by 10 foot plane. And I'm going to move it into place underneath using the move tool here. And do I have center on? I'm going to snap to the center of it, and it's going to allow me to in 3D snap to the center of that. So my chair is now in the center of that rectangle, and I can create a solid using the extrude planar curve of that object to create a floor plate. And I'm going to type in -12 to just do -12 inches or a foot. And if we scroll in over here, yeah, they're touching. And now I want to do some quick walls, and so the way we could do that is utilizing our surface extrude curve straight, can actually start picking the extrusion edge. You could probably pick both of those edges at the same time, and I just typed in 120 for 10 feet. So I'm starting to create a small scene, kind of like just a play scene, right? And if we switch to our properties of our, right now I don't have anything selected, so what it's giving me is the properties to the viewport. And so you can theoretically change your projection of that to maybe a 2-point perspective, or regular perspective, or parallel. So 3D sections kind of, but then 2-point perspective as well, right? And then also here in the camera, we're looking through a camera in this perspective view, and that's really the one that you'll be rendering out. You can create more cameras, I believe, but we don't really need to get into that at the moment. We just utilize the one perspective view that we have. But we can change the lens length, and so 28, woo, that didn't do 28. Represents basically a 28 millimeter lens. So depending on what lens size you want to go with, you can affect the way that looks. These X, Y, and Z coordinates are basically, as I rotate around this thing, my X, Y, and Z coordinates change. So if you wanted to start utilizing those to set up your camera angle, I'm not really sure why you'd want to do that, but you can do that. And then the target location. Which would probably best be done in a top and a front view or something like that. But basically it changes what you're looking at, right? So you can also replace the camera as well, but that also affects the target. So I don't know, I don't really see a need to start messing with that stuff as long as you kind of get where you want situated in space, and whether it's a 2-point perspective or regular perspective where it's not 2-point perspective, making that distinction or choice. And then you can also set up a background wallpaper here, and so if my computer doesn't bog down on me, I don't know, let's just use one of these for the fun of it. It starts to set up, puts that in the background of the image. So you can put background images in, you can make it color or gray here, or you can turn it on and off down here in the wallpaper settings. There's other places where you can make that change as well, in render settings. So render settings, if you open those up, brings you to your document properties, and Isn't this where we found that? Yeah, background. I don't remember now. It's been 12 hours or so since the last class. Remember that, Clay? Remember where we found that other place where you could change that? No. Right here, wallpaper. See, I just had to kickstart something, I don't know. At any rate, there's a couple of places where you can make that change. I don't know. Seems to me like you probably wouldn't want to have a background on, that you'd want to drop an image in the background in Photoshop or something like that. At any rate, so when you select an object under its properties, now you have the option to change the material directly and assign the material either by layer or by object. And so if we were to go to our layers, there's an option here to, add a material, which brings up a very similar dialog box as going to our properties and selecting by object. And so I guess the nice thing now in V5 is that you don't have to assign materials based upon layers alone. You can assign them to specific objects, which is pretty cool. And the way you can do this is you can create a new material, and that brings you to a dialog box that basically has a material library within Rhino itself. And so you can kind of explore that there's not a ton of materials. Like in Revit, there's like a super ton of materials. There's not a lot of materials to work with, but there's enough that you could probably not have to create your own materials if you didn't want to. The other option is you can navigate somewhere else, obviously. And grab your own materials. And so the other way you can do that is under color here. You can click the empty button, and this takes you kind of into your own libraries or wherever you were. Kind of allows you to pick whatever materials you want. If you had noticed, I navigated to this prior just a few seconds ago, and these weren't there. So when you click on the new what am I going to say here? So when you click on the new button, it basically wants you to utilize one of their materials. And you can change the name of it, obviously, up here, or change back to a material that you were using. Once you have a material placed, and this is a bitmap texture versus, now I realize why, because it was looking for all supported formats. If I'm sure if you'd clicked all files and navigated through the new, let's just see, but I'm going to imagine that it's going to allow us to, yeah, those materials are now there. I don't know if anybody had noticed that when I had selected new and it brings you to the material library, they're actually bitmaps, and so if I don't change my file format down here I navigate somewhere else where I have images, they're not going to show up until I switch it to all files, and then I can select one of these materials. So when you have already applied a material, you can open it and start to either change the material here if you want a different material for that particular material. You can go ahead and open up a new dialog and go and find something else. But this allows you to change the repeated pattern, the mapping of the material itself. So if it's not being mapped properly the way that you want it to, you can change that here in the rotation of it. And they give you kind of a lot of output options in here, but a lot of this stuff has to deal with actually kind of reminds me a bit of 3ds Max a little bit. They give you a lot of options of what you can change as far as the hue shift, the grain, the gammas. So you can do it per individual material, the saturation of the material, the multiplier of the material. Also like the levels. It doesn't really update very well in my opinion, but at any rate. If you don't like how the material is being applied as far as mapping characteristics, you can also click on texture mapping, and with that object selected you can choose a different site type of texture mapping. So it's kind of a weird interface, but I always do that. Deselected the object, that's what happened. Select seam. I don't want to select a seam. The planar and surface mapping are typically the two that you'll want to stick with as far as getting a material to apply correctly. But then it gives you additional resources of the repeated pattern and the UVW directions. So the XYZ, I don't know why they just don't call it XYZ. It's kind of annoying, but 3DS does that too. And you're like, which one is which? I guess I have to change one to figure out which one it is. I don't use it enough to actually know the difference between the UV and W. I'm ashamed to say, but I can say it. I don't know, let's leave that marble. That sounds good to me. So we can start to change the by object and create a new material or utilize one that I've already loaded in. And this is surface mapping, so it's mapping this surface and then mapping this surface and then mapping that surface versus come on. Yeah, that's where it's understanding the view UV and W, unfortunately. But also in the in here, I believe we've got some options as well, as far as the mapping of the surface too. And I don't know why it's not changing on me now. It was before. Alright, I obviously don't understand this enough. It drives me crazy. Just trying to see how you can get it to change. So there's multiple kind of places where you can affect the mapping of how the material applies to the surface. And so, you know, changing it to the WCX box style, you know, starts to change how it's being applied to the surface. And then the size of it is kind of counterintuitive here. The smaller it is, the larger. It's really terrible. I've managed to make that surface look terrible. I have managed to make that look terrible. I could have sworn. Okay. That's the one that I wanted. So the mapping channel. And for some reason, how did I get repeated 40 times? So it's being repeated 40 times on this surface and 40 times this direction, and so that's why it's looking really terrible. As you reduce the size of it, it actually gets bigger, the material itself. Seems really counterintuitive to me, but it's the amount of times it repeats on the surface. So if you want it to repeat 40 times, the material is going to get smaller. If you want to repeat it once or 0.5, it's going to be bigger. I guess when I start to explain it like that, it starts to make some sense. But initially, it intuitively doesn't make sense. It doesn't to me. I don't know. It obviously makes clear sense to Clay because he's laughing his ass off up here. I feel like I ran through that really quickly. What else did we cover in section 1?
Create another half hour in section 1.
Yeah, we're looking at 45 minutes. Another 15 minutes of stuff. So, I'm going to create a new material, and I'm going to just use like metal, like a silver on this. Oh yeah, we talked about lighting and renders. Yeah. Oh, this night class is tough. I guess I'll apply a couple materials to these as well, just so it starts to what are we doing here? Maybe some brick. well, that looks pretty ugly. But that's okay, because it doesn't really matter. So, under our render tab here for render tools, we have the ability to turn on the sun.
I remember that.
And this dialog box may not appear here. It might be just sitting out here in space. It's nice to just kind of tuck it away as an additional gosh, I keep doing that. That's what I was trying to do. So there's just more kind of stuff you can work with here. I'm going to make it a little bit larger so you can see what's going on. We could turn on the sun, right? And basically we have an option to do manual control, which allows us, I feel like there's more to it than this. Why is it being finicky? So the manual control here allows us to change the azimuth, which is basically your angle from east to west, and then the altitude is the sun angle itself in relationship to your building. So, you know, like a 20-degree altitude would probably represent like January, something like that. 60 degrees would start to represent summer, you know, at noon. And then obviously changing this number, you know, swings it, you know, the daytime, basically what where the angle is positioned from east to west. This thing should give us more information. Yeah. So I don't know why I wasn't able to scroll down there. But if you turn on the manual control, it only gives you the sun position and where you can affect it this way. If you turn that off, you have more manual control. You can change the time of year. You can change what time of day it is. This little red dot indicates where you are in the world. So you can start to change that by selecting randomly. You can also find a specific location. And then if you click here, the here button, it took me to Boise, Idaho, which is what it thinks is the closest to our latitude and longitude. You can also search for a place here, and then you have the option of changing your time zone. So California is probably fairly close. And then, you know, so we're starting to hone in kind of our region. So noon in January. Or now. Click now. It's now nighttime. Now it seems that thing's there. So the skylight portal gives you a little more light. You can see, brightens everything up a little bit. And the ambient light though is not super great, so that's something that you're going to want to probably manipulate in Photoshop or something like that. So we can start to change. If we turn on the ground plane option, we could add grass or something. And so now we have a ground plane in our image with a horizon line. And of course you can change the texture mapping and the size of it as well. And then lights. So the sun is considered a directional light. The skylight is just kind of like an overall light. You can turn those on and off. We can turn them completely off. And we can start to place our own lights in here. So we have different options of types of lights up here. So if we just create like a sphere of light, start to move it up, right? It's just acting as a sphere of light. And so you could, copy this over a couple times, and as you increase the amount of lights, it gets brighter, obviously. But you can also, start to have multiple shadows on an object. And in the rendered view, you're not going to see the actual symbols for the lights, but in the other views, you will be able to see those. So if you wanted to line them up in a specific location, you can do that. The spotlight does what it says. So depending on what viewport you're kind of selecting the end result at, you can start to create a spotlight. So maybe move these lights out of the way so you can kind of see the effect of just what a spotlight does. Or we don't even have to do that. We can start to turn them off here. And so I imagine you could rename these different types of light, but it kind of tells you here as well what they are. So like this unnamed is a spotlight. This light one that I copied over is a point light. You can change its intensity. Not sure what units that is, or if you can even go, 100 is the largest intensity, probably down to 1 is the lowest intensity, or 0. So you can dim the light to whatever you want. Looks like you can apply a color filter to that light. Start to get a different hue or temperature of light source. So then you have directional lights that's similar to the sun. I feel like V4 didn't have a sun, and you just use directional lights, which is this. Basically, it's a big giant arrow that acts as a sun source. I've got the wrong one selected here. Yeah, so that pretty much acts as a sun source, and that's that directional here. So if I turned off all these other ones, it's kind of acting as similar to our sun. So it's kind of just the old version of how you would create a sun. Create a rectangular light source by clicking and dragging. And you could even start to rotate that. Probably rotating that really poorly. So there's lots of different light sources you can utilize. And then also a linear light source. We didn't talk about flattening stuff, huh, to 2D, as I recall, now I think about it.
Yeah, you were looking for.
I mentioned it, and then I didn't actually show you guys. So let's just kind of turn off all this crap for a second. And go back to maybe wireframe. I'm assuming that you can, assuming is probably bad to say, but you know, I can create an additional layer and probably put all my lights on that additional layer. You can turn them off. So you can put them on a separate layer if you want to. Turn those off and layer these on. Default layer. Maybe add one more layer and call that pictures or something. Just kind of assign. If you type in make 2D, you can select a particular object and hit enter. You can apply it to a certain layer if you want, but what it does is it flattens that to a 2D. So it flattened this shape to something that's two-dimensional so that you could cut that out in the laser cutter true size, and then as you fold it to manipulate it to the rest of the object when you start to build it, it's actually the correct size, and as you bend it, it'll be the correct size, which is kind of cool. So you could do that for all of the objects and lay them out kind of systematically, and then export those to an AutoCAD file to utilize for the laser cutter. Yeah, so is there another way to do that? I feel like there's another way to do that. Never mind. I'll have to look it up. So that pretty much sums up everything for now. We'll touch back on a few things when the final assignment comes up. But besides for that, we'll leave the rest of the 30 minutes here for you guys to ask any questions. Basically open lab to work on the assignment and ask any questions of us that you're struggling with. Resume the video here.
Because if I wanted to manipulate the image in Photoshop.
Yeah, so the rendered view is just showing the materials like realistic,
Yeah.
but when you actually click on the render itself to render, it goes to a new dialog box where it actually renders the settings out. So where you start to change that is in the render settings. We can change our DPI to being 300 pixels per inch, and we can change our resolution size. If we change this to inches, you can see that the largest size, as you decrease this, right, so 150 DPI, that image gets larger. So that's 1080 by 1920. So, that's like fairly high resolution. And so you can also increase, what the hell does that say? Antilizing, how many times it goes over the render, I believe. So you can bump that up to something higher. I'm going to uncheck this wallpaper. How do I turn that off? Thought I had it turned off.
Do you have to change ambient light?
Here we go. So we could change the background, and that's no, the ambient light, to answer that question, all our lights are off, but we start turning on our skylights and then re-rendering that. This might take a few minutes to do, but
So once it's done, do you just click on the save and then save it as an image for your Photoshop image?
yeah, so you're going to basically save the image, and you have an option to save it as a JPEG or a PNG. PNGs drop out the background, JPEGs don't, and so does, you can save it as an HDRI file, interesting. But you'll probably want to do a PNG or JPEG depending on if you want to drop in a background image or not. And then you can certainly open up those two file formats in Photoshop. So this is taking a bit longer to render, but I'm sure once you zoom in, it's fairly high resolution. And then the other thing is with the render dialog box, it gives you a lot of exposure options that you can manipulate. But again, these are all kind of exposure options that you can manipulate in Photoshop a little bit easier. So I'd recommend utilizing that. But you can add different effects as well to the render. So
Yeah, so you can like see it on the marble now. It's like reflected a little bit.
yeah. And then you can obviously like change the RGBs of it, grayscale. I haven't really messed with this stuff much, but at any rate, you'd save that as a JPEG somewhere, and then you could load that into Photoshop and manipulate it even further. The other thing that you can do is you can clone it. So if you were working on a render and it wasn't quite right, you know, you could clone the render and then make adjustments, re-render, and compare the two and say, okay, where do I need to keep making these small incremental adjustments, maybe in this particular material or that particular material. And so if you're in that stage of kind of perfecting your render, you probably don't want to render it as a large image yet. You know, you want to work on a small image first to get it right, and then go ahead and do the larger image. So it's just a matter of setting these to something smaller so that the renders happen quicker and you can kind of run through them.
So the best like DPI would be the 150 probably from the in Photoshop. Or should I set it at like 300?
Yeah, I would imagine that probably 300 is going to give you the best, but it's not going to give you very large images. So you just kind of have to play with the resolution size. That looks about to be the largest, so that's 2400 divided by 300 is 8 inches, and 3200 divided by 300 is about 10 inches. So you can kind of think about it like that as well. Yeah. And then you can always change that DPI in Photoshop later on as well. Yeah, thanks for asking that. I knew I'd missed something.
Yeah, I was just